Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and did an edited volume for
Excellent.
Oxford University
Well, we're
Press.
going to go live here, so I'm going to introduce you properly and get you to tell us some of those things we've just chit-chatted about here.
Alrighty.
Okay, my name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Barbara Oakley, PhD. Barbara is an engineer, author, and researcher whose path has been anything but ordinary. A U.S. Army vet and former signal officer, she began her career studying Russian before earning advanced degrees in engineering and system science. She worked as a trawler translator, we'll get into that, in the Bering Sea, a radio operator at the South Pole Station in Antarctica, where she met her husband, and an engineer uh, in industry before becoming a professor at Oakland University. Her acclaimed research bridges neuroscience and social behavior, and her work has appeared everywhere from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Barbara is the author of many books, and a recent Wall Street Journal article, Censorship Hurts Our Brains, literally, which is what we're going to talk about first, by the way, and I have it here to read bits from, and is teaching a course in free speech, all of which we will link to. In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer is my podcast. Please subscribe right now on YouTube to this live stream and also later when it replays, to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. You can also follow my new project, The Gospel of Zip, at thegospelofzip.com. So, you've had such an interesting life. We'll just delve into that a little bit first. You and I have one thing in common. I've never served in the military, and you grew up as an Air Force child and then went into the Army. You said you enlisted right out of high school. So then you became an officer. So did that happen after you went to university, or did you go through the process and become an officer, having been an enlisted private to start with?
So I was a private to start with, and then I got really lucky. I got an in-service ROTC scholarship that allowed me to complete my first degree in Slavic languages and literature, which was not really very helpful when I went out onto the job market.
Well, we have a term in Massachusetts that you're familiar with because you come here a lot, for people like you, and that is we call you wicked smart. Because
No,
when
I can simulate
I think
sometimes.
you're wicked smart when I look at all the things you've done. And we have one thing in common, and that is when my son volunteered for the Marine Corps right out of a swanky North Shore private high school near Boston. He was the only kid who had gone into the military ever, basically. And he went enlisted into the Corps and then went to Signals Intel, and then in the end was under the command of the NSA rather than the Marines in Afghanistan for 2 tours, and then one in Iraq, came back safely, went to the University of Chicago, got a degree in modern European history, lives nearby in my neighborhood. And for the last 17 years, I've been helping him and his wife with their 3 kids, who are now 17, 15, and 11. And because they lived across the street, my wife and I have been their only childcare providers other than their parents, who both work. So I've done the military family wait in trepidation during a war while your son's being shot at, and I've done the North Shore Boston academic, Volvo driving, higher education worshiping community that I live in. So I sort of get your academic career. And then I was so interested in this article you wrote on free speech because you basically spoke, truth to power, in the sense that you write and you say censorship hurts our brains, literally. Neuroscience confirms the importance of free speech to individual citizens and to democracy itself. And this is very recent, September 16, so 2 minutes ago, as it were, in news time. And then you talk about the assassination of Charlie Kirk on the campus of the Utah Valley University is a human tragedy. And then you talk about the fact that our brains are built to form habits, the basal ganglia, deep learning circuits that automate whatever we repeat, don't absorb only tennis serves or piano scales. They also wire in patterns of thought. If the only messages we hear are one-sided, the brain's habit circuits carve them into grooves of thought that resist change. Rigidity at the neural level breeds rigidity at the civic level. So we're going to read more of that article, but let's get into that first, because I guess you say ripped from the headlines is a phrase that's used too often, but in this case, I'm 73. I've known political people all my life. My mother used to stay in the Ford White House, and we've known people in power, and I've seen a lot. But what I've never seen in my lifetime until this era is a country that literally is divided in a sense that um, we can hardly speak to each other. And if you show any sympathy to someone's ideas who's not in your camp, you get feedback. For instance, on this program, I have had the editor of the Wall Street Journal, and I've had writers who would be considered conservative. And I've had people who talk in ways that is not familiar to some of my trans friends and people in the gay community who are used to only hearing things from a certain point of view. Um, so we've had people get back to us and say, well, if you have a person like this on, I'll never watch your program again. So basically, as a podcaster who's also an author and who writes opinionated books of my own from my own perspective, kind of an ex-evangelical who's moved left, one of the things that I've maintained from an earlier era of American history as a 73-year-old grandfather is the ability to talk to people that I disagree with and actually learn from them and then find the points that I do agree with. So I've kind of put my money where my mouth is on this podcast to do my bit to keep those neural pathways open for people who happen to listen to me and in my own head of reading things that don't necessarily come from my little bubble. So the first thing I want to ask you, and I'm not trying to politicize this, but you showed some courage in diving into the Charlie Kirk post-assassination moment with an article on basically keeping an open mind to different points of view you disagree with. Um, and I we had an illustration, and again, this is more political than I really usually am in a very direct sense of naming names. But when Charlie Kirk's widow stands up and says, "I forgive the person who killed him," and a few moments later, the president of the United States is saying, "But I hate the people I disagree with, and I hate my enemies," you have a kind of a visual moment played on a huge stage of a nation which is no longer practicing from the top down the idea of keeping those neural pathways open and linking to people and talking with people who you may disagree with and who may even dislike you intensely, which I run into because some people dislike me intensely because I left my evangelical background. It was a very famous evangelical family, and I get a lot of feedback and I hear words like traitor and so forth. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is not your article, but with your life experience of military service, being a translator, meeting someone in the Arctic and getting married, this incredible life you've had and scholarship, how do you see the moment into which you wrote your article? What is the underlying condition your article is trying to address by looking at the neuroscience, but neuroscience that immediately is put into the context of something very controversial, which is listening to people who have a very different opinion and not saying you hate them, but hearing them out. And I am from the left, but I fault the left for its version of wokeness when it comes to canceling and the rest. I hate it. Speaking of hatred, I don't hate people, but I hate that because it closes off the avenue of discussion. And I come from an evangelical fundamentalist background. And so, when I hear someone saying, talking about canceling people because they don't like their ideas, say on gay marriage or whatever it may be, all I can think of is my mother and her attitudes, well, here's what it says in the Bible. And if you're outside of that, we can't even talk to you. So that's a long, rambling intro to a really good article. And now I'm not going to do the talking for the rest of this project. I'm going to ask you to do the talking. But I'd like you to address the wider context of the issue that you wrote about in that one column, because I think it's a huge, huge, huge thing now of not listening to opposing things and all living in this crazy algorithm bubble that these greedy online companies feed us into to make sure we only talk to people like ourselves or who seem to agree with us. End of
Well,
pitch.
go ahead. You had a last thought there.
Yeah, I'm just saying, end of my little sermon.
Oh, okay. Well, that was a wonderful sermon. So I think I could listen to you all day. The thing, I think we are often shaped in ways that we hardly recognize by the
Mm,
circumstances which we find ourselves in and which we put ourselves in. So for me, early on, just that idea of, oh, I've got to move here, move here, move here. Every time I, make friends, then up you go and off you go.
mm,
And um, sometimes they call people like me sort of third culture kids
mhm.
because you're not really of one culture because you keep having to change. And I think what that did, although I certainly didn't recognize it at the time, is that allowed me to begin like being able to take perspective and hold an attitude in mind, but also maybe sometimes holding a contrary attitude in mind
Mm,
so that you could, you've got two ideas that are cognitively dissonant from one another, but you can kind of hold them both in mind, and you're not sitting there going, oh, because I am this, I can't even consider that.
right.
But then I think because of that early exposure, it helped me to, I mean, it's really uncomfortable to keep moving and going even to different cultures and different places and different peoples and so forth. So it takes time to learn to become more comfortable with being uncomfortable, and that's a very important skill to cultivate. And I didn't realize that that's what I was doing, but by traveling really now as it's ended up all around the world,
Yeah,
and meeting so many people and beginning to have a good understanding, it's never going to be perfect, but what does another culture, what does a completely different perspective mean from whatever I'm holding in
yeah,
mind?
yeah,
And being able to talk to people, even if you know that on position A, B, and C, you have absolutely nothing in common, but also realizing that they're human, they've come from the backgrounds they're coming from. If you came from those same backgrounds, you would have exactly the same sort of underpinnings and thoughts
mm,
about those ideas. And so, what can be invaluable is simply to enjoy what you can find in common with people, and find it. I so often, it was a little bit demoralizing because I too have friends on the far left and on
mm,
the far right, and I was a little sad because the idea is, don't just demonize the people on the other side.
yeah, yeah,
And that was a central idea of that article. And then some of my friends on the left would go, yeah, how are we going to get past these Nazis over on the other side? And I'm like,
yeah,
that was the point of the article.
yeah,
And so often people only let a certain stream of information come in to affect their unconscious thinking about things.
yeah,
But they truly, I mean, absolutely 100% believe that they are getting the other side's opinions because they're getting these little carefully curated snapshots from
sure.
their side, that portrays them as terrible people.
Yeah,
And each side can play that game, but they don't realize that they're, in some sense, being deeply manipulated. And, I might say, I mean, if I ever were to say that to some of my friends, they would say, oh, I am not being manipulated. It's
yeah,
absolutely
yeah,
true. And yet you can watch a some kind of current event unfold, and you'll see the talking points of the other side, and then lo and behold, they will, parrot these talking points exactly, even though if you ask them truly, what does that side think of, and how do they portray, how are they thinking
sure.
of it? They simply can't do that. They've got this straw man consideration of the other side. So this article was really just an attempt to kind of lay these ideas out and show that there's really good neuroscience that can underpin why it's so important to develop cognitive
Yeah,
flexibility.
and I like the approach because it's usually, you hear from the sort of what I call the sort of left wing of the evangelical movement, that we all always just get along for its own sake, but there's never a reason for this other than good feeling. But you say, for instance, rigidity at the neural level breeds rigidity at the civic level. Economists studying East Germany, including Harvard's Alberta Alesina, found that decades of socialist rule left scars on behavior. Citizens became more cautious, less entrepreneurial, and slower to trust. A society that punished initiative and rewarded conformity trained its population to avoid novelty. Those scars of enforced consensus outlasted the Berlin Wall. Neuroscience also shows that cognitive flexibility isn't automatic. Like any skill, it must be trained. In a paper titled, "One Cannot Simply Be Flexible," Ghent University cognitive scientist Sene Braham, if I'm saying it right, and colleagues showed that when people are rewarded for switching tasks, they later switch more readily, even without realizing why. When switching is discouraged, they become more rigid. Flexibility is like a muscle. It grows with practice and feedback and time. And, I think in generating flexibility on ideological issues, sometimes the old phrase about walking in someone's shoes for a few steps so you feel who they are. Having come, for instance, from a fundamentalist background, raised in an environment in which to be gay or to be a homosexual was something to be, you were kind to people who were, if you were, quote, a good Christian, you showed the love of Jesus and you said, well, we're all sinners, and you did not bully. But you nevertheless were raised holding on to the idea that gay love is somehow wrong and it's a sin in the same way that adultery is, or premarital sex and so forth. And I think, having come from my background, one advantage I have is understanding that a lot of people who reacted to a 50-year culture war attack as they saw it on their beliefs can't simply be denounced as fascist in 2025 because they have maintained the teaching in their own minds that was handed them by parents, grandmothers, churches, and hundreds of years of culture, whether it's on quote unquote sanctity of life issues or homosexuality and so forth and so on. So one problem I think we have is in not understanding that some people have actual sincere beliefs rooted in who they actually are at their most fundamental level. Gender, for instance. Take my wife Jeannie's annoyance at being told she can't use the word mother or parent anymore because somehow this will mean that it's controversial when it comes to trans people who you have to support if you're on the left because of, and then there's all sorts of reasons, without understanding that having been a mother, of 3 kids and a grandmother of 5 kids, and having lived in a completely different era, raised in a Roman Catholic background, then converted to evangelicalism, then having left that and become much more secular and left wing, nevertheless, the way she sees herself is as a woman and sees sex differences very clearly. Now, whether that's correct or not biologically, to then say, well, then she must be a fascist because only fascists would think this, or if someone's against gay marriage, they've got to be a Nazi, is to basically say, we will not tolerate anyone being themselves when it comes to their most deeply held things. And when it's flipped, and you look at my friend, for instance, Ernie Gregg, who's my producer producing this show, and you talk about gay marriage to him as a gay married man, to attack gay marriage is not to attack a theory, it's to attack who he is as a person and where he's been living in a 17-year relationship that's been fruitful and wonderful. So, one of the things I found really instructive about your article is that I think that when it comes to the left and right playing culture war games with each other and deliberately annoying each other and trolling each other, because the left does this just as much as the right does. And that's one thing the left never admits, but it's true, because having been on the other side, I know what it feels like. Um, one thing I'd like you to address now is just the misunderstanding of what a human is in terms of the baggage we bring to the table, that when you argue with it and attack it and then
Oops.
denounce the other person, don't worry about that phone stuff, the kind of damage we do to people psychologically by attacking the foundational elements of who they are as if this is a political issue, when with most people, it's not political. It's how you see yourself as a man, as a woman, as heterosexual, as gay, whatever it may be. We just don't seem to have any understanding of that anymore because we live in our bubble and we attack anybody who's outside of it. And again, that's sort of a long speech, but I think it's the heart of our culture war. It's why Donald Trump is president, because there's a huge group of Americans who got sick of this. And now their alternative, from my point of view, is a horrible one because he's not a good person. But I totally get where they're coming from when it's the sort of burn it all down, make the left weep the way they've made us weep by going up against every single thing we were raised with. People don't see it on the left. And I talk to more of a progressive audience. So I try to say more what's wrong with ourself than pointing to others and just dismissing them the way they makes people comfortable. I just won't do it anymore.
So what is the crux of the question you're posing?
The crux of the question I'm posing is your article talks about the actual neurological damage it does to us. So definitely being able to sustain two ideas simultaneously. For instance, have my best friend be Ernie Gregg, who's my producer and a gay married man, and at the same time totally understand where my mother was coming from at the same time, and not denounce her as a fascist in memory because she got something I think wrong, has a definite application to yours article, because what I see in your article is a deeper issue, and that is if this is the question, if this is the neurological truth of who we are, if this is what neuroscience says, then obviously we evolved to be able to be more tolerant than people are being today, because if we hadn't evolved to be that way, it wouldn't be neurologically damaging to not be able to entertain ideas outside of your own bubble or to be tolerant of people you disagree with. If that's damaging, then it's like saying, well, if you eat too much red meat, it's damaging because we evolved in hunter-gatherer societies where meat protein was rarer than, say, eating tubers and digging for roots if you lived in the Nainai and put of the Kung tribe that had been there for 100,000 years, living off roots and berries and twigs and vegetables, as well as doing some hunting. So I want to ask you, as someone who's scientifically grounded, if the neurological evidence that you present in your article doesn't tell us something about how we evolved to best function as humans, because otherwise it wouldn't have a bad effect on us to not be able to be tolerant and to receive other opinions. And I think it's rooted in our evolution, which has to do with the survival of the friendliest and the ability to cooperate. That's why we're still here. So I think your article is another evidence of that. That's where the question and the comment comes from. And is it? Do you see it that way?
So there's a really interesting phenomenon, and that is that really, really intelligent people are sometimes very difficult to reason with, in the sense that they can have these deeply biased, underpinnings, sets of beliefs, and they're so smart that they can figure out ways to justify whatever they see as being supportive of their beliefs. And they're able to do this because they've got, in a kind of a rudimentary way, I see this as you've got this gigantic neural net because you're super smart. And so you can ripple through and find ways to justify things that, someone who's not so bright would struggle with. And so sometimes an equally plausible case, at least in my opinion, is that people evolved to castigate and murder people who weren't like them. And there's quite a bit of evidence throughout history and prehistory that that's what people kind of did a lot. Sometimes I sort of wonder, about 100,000 years ago, there's evidence that people had slightly bigger skulls. And larger skulls are associated with more intelligence. There's a correlation there. And I can't help but think that, we've been sort of killing off the smarter ones because there's also a lot of jealousy within human beings. And so if there's a really good, kind, wonderful human being and they're super smart and they're really able to be great leaders of the clan, well, maybe you're a little jealous.
Mm-hmm.
And you're willing to do things that that person wouldn't do. Well, you kill them, and then you take over, and then
Yeah.
you have lots of progeny because you're the one who is the one who's in charge of the tribe. Now, am I just being a smart person who is kind of coming up with a justification for these ideas?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe so, but I do, well, not that I'm that smart, but I do think there's a case to be made for either. I mean, people, um, didn't they evolved to some extent, it seems, be kind within their clans, be supportive, be helpful to your in group, but that often meant doing kind of nasty things to your out group. and
Sure.
and unfortunately there's plenty of evidence that humans they like to identify with their in group.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's continued. Brian Hare and his wife and writing partner and research partner at the Duke Canine Center wrote this book called The Survival of the Friendliest, and they talk about that. And that is, yes, the survival of the friendliest is true. It's not the survival of the strongest, but unfortunately, the cooperation is mostly within your in group, and to the out group, it's like tough luck. You're not part of our thing. And of course, we see that illustrated, by today's politics. I just want to go back to your book here and read a little I mean, not your book, your article. As Cass Sestine argued in his book, Going to Extremes, when like-minded people talk only with one another, they grow more extreme. But head-on clashes with opponents don't necessarily soften rigidity. Brain scans by psychologist Jonas Kaplan and colleagues showed that when subjects' political beliefs were challenged, the brain's default mode network, which anchors our sense of self, which is what I was talking about at some length
Yeah.
a moment ago, lit up alongside threat circuits. At the same time, prefrontal regions that normally support flexibility felt quiet. So again, what I'm asking you is, it just seems to me that what your article is sort of saying, if you read, um, what underlies it is this idea that somehow, we're still here in an evolutionary sense. We have survived because of this survival of the friendliest thing within the in group. But now that there are billions of us, and we're armed with these lethal weapons and so forth and so on, besides being bad for your brain, is evolution sending us a signal saying, if you cannot look at other people's ideas with some tolerance and a vision that the out group may have something to tell you. For instance, left-wing Americans denouncing everybody as a fascist or a Nazi who thinks that traditional marriage is the only way to be married, and thereby alienating 50% of the country and winding up with Donald Trump, rather than having some sympathy for other points of view, or vice versa. Um, how many times does this have to spin out and not work before we all collectively say, enough of these culture war issues, let's try to find something that we can actually agree on, not in the sense of, hey, let's all learn to get along, but let's listen to the signal that neurological science is sending us in terms of the way the actual brain functions best, which according to your article is not to just live in your own little bubble. And as you put it, in other words, once convictions are woven into our sense of self, challenge doesn't loosen them, it locks them in. So that seems to describe the moment I'm in. That seems to describe the moment half the people watching or listening to this are in. And I don't care whether they're from the left or the right. And I find it very disingenuous that people on the left, who regard themselves usually as smarter, better educated, aren't ready to admit that they are in the whole in-group, out-group thing, and that all the terminology they've developed to describe people who vote for Trump, say, is just part of the way we dismiss the outgroup without ever really looking at what emotionally has driven them into the positions they're in. That's what I think, but I want to hear what you think.
Well, one thing that was a little bit problematic, I'm trying to look up the original name of my article. So the article name that was put on by, and they're a great editing group, and they did a super job. But they added this different title, which is
Sure.
totally within their prerogative, and in fact, that's almost
Yeah.
always what they do.
Yes. Well, the
So
gatekeepers have a way of doing that.
yes, so it became Censorship Hurts Our Brains, literally,
Yeah.
which some of the commenters were like, how do you say that? Literally, what the heck?
Yeah. Yeah. What's that mean?
Yeah. And so let me see. So what I originally titled it myself as was Rigid Brains, Brittle Democracies.
Yeah.
Neuroscience shows how free speech keeps societies flexible.
Read that title again because it's a really good one. They should have stuck with it. Just read it clear and
So
slow
it's,
so we can digest it because that actually that is really the point of your article, having studied it. That
yes.
title sums it up. Can you read it again?
So it was rigid brains, rigid brains, brittle democracies.
Yeah.
Neuroscience shows how free speech keeps societies flexible.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to brittle brains, that pontificate on how awful everybody is who disagrees with them and doesn't realize that we all have a history we bring with us to the table. The irony is, of course, that 100 years from now, the people who claim with such certainty enlightened positions will themselves be looked at as backward because that's how things move forward. So you're you're head of the ACLU that's all about trans rights today will be looked at the way we look at unregenerate racists who attack Martin Luther King Jr. at some point, because that's how history moves on. So we're all in that boat too. Of relevance only in your own moment. And you kind of speak to that in this paragraph in your article that I'm going to read you. People point to social media as the trigger, but narrowing of perspective often starts much earlier in classrooms. The glee some teachers expressed after the killing, that's a Kirk, revealed how easily bias can masquerade as neutrality. Studies find educators lean heavily on one side politically, yet many sincerely believe they're impartial. And the bias blind spot in action. From primary school through college, dissent is rare and pressure runs mostly one way, etching patterns that are hard to undo. China has long understood this. It now pulls Tibetan children into state-run schools from the age of 4, stripping away language and culture so Communist Party ideology can fix identity before anything else can take root. And of course, you see that on both sides of our political divide. So homeschool Christian moms keeping their kids out of the public education system, as I was kept out, by the way, to make the indoctrination total as possible. And then a lot of those kids rebel and escape. So that's the flip side. And then you see that very much from the left, of people who just talk to each other and basically denounce anyone and have epithets and insults ready for anybody who comes forward and sort of brings anything forward into the present of something they view as backward. And we all live in this bubble. So talk about that tendency within the educational environment. So of course, a lot of people talk about our elite universities, of which, you're in those circles, skewing very much to the left and saying, well, where are all the conservative professors that could have balanced out the left-wing academy? And that's a valid point. That's something that Trump and his people have attacked, and they're completely right about that. I don't like what they've done, but that's not an untruth to say the academy has skewed very far left in this country for a very long time and has been totally out of step with tens of millions of Americans who expressed this in the last couple of elections. How do you see that as someone within the academic community? Because it's not just Chinese school children, it's our own academic community has skewed far left and stayed there. Why did that happen, and how is it that the left that prides itself to open-mindedness has not practiced any?
I think, you bring up so many exciting and fascinating points for me. But first, I would like to ask you, how did you change?
I fell on my head off without riding a bike without a helmet. No, okay, that part's not true. But I often wonder that. But this will sound sort of sentimental, but literally, I did it for love, and that is, I was groomed to be an asshole by divine right, which is the way I put it. I was told men are in charge, women are there to serve you. I got a young woman pregnant. Her name's Jeannie. We've been married now for 55 years. We're incredibly in love, and this is the best part of our life together. But the early days weren't that way. And the only reason she stuck around is because she was patient and kind, but also came from a Catholic background, and sort of vows meant something. So you stuck around, you stuck with it, you kept going. You didn't just divorce him because he's an asshole. And I gradually changed. But the reason I left my evangelical beliefs is that I began to correlate the fights we were having and the way I was treating her as this sort of dominating male jerk with how I had been groomed to be. And I began to slowly realize that I had been groomed to basically feed my worst instincts instead of what I believed elevating me, it was justifying my worst impulses. You're in charge. Your wife should obey you. And when I began to look at that, I began to change because of a sense of the fact, if I can just put it this way, I love Jeannie a lot more than correct theology. And I began to rebel against myself and wonder, how did you get to be this idiot you don't even understand? Why is your knee-jerk reaction always anger and control and dominating people? And so basically, the most basic level of the beginning of my change was a dissatisfaction with the way I was treating someone I love passionately. And that's not just my wife, but my children. And basically, it was like unraveling a tapestry. Once I pulled at that thread, that was my point of entry. Then a lot of other things came apart. And basically truth issues, theological issues, how you see the world, philosophy, politics. But the beginning for me was completely personal. It was just simply, I got very tired of being the bad guy in a relationship where I was married to an incredibly wonderful woman who deserved a lot better. And it took years for that person, that's me, to grow into that. But the barrier for me was that I had a father who had been very domineering of my mother, somewhat abusive of her, even though he was a famous evangelical. Once in a while she'd have bruises on her arms because he would sock her if they got in a fight. And I grew up in that environment. And that was told to me, corporal punishment of children, hit your wife if you need to, et cetera. No one put it in those terms exactly. There was a sort of a hidden thing there too. But as I began to just see my own married life developing and how I was as a father, I didn't like that person. And then I moved from that to looking at the world I was in and realizing that these evangelical leaders I was schmoozing with, like Pat Robertson and Oral Roberts and all these other guys, I spoke at all those places and was on their TV shows and so on when my dad was very famous in that environment, that these guys were all con artists. They were liars, they were cheats, and they were stealing. And they became very rich and very powerful, and they were not good people. And essentially, my own success in that environment as a young nepotistic sidekick of my father offered me two paths. You can be this guy forever, or you can jump into you can get out, even though you're going to go broke when you do it, which we did. You're going to get out while you're still young enough to have something of a life. But the real reason was Jeannie. It was like, I'm not going to be this person to this woman I love. She deserves better. And I tried to become better. So I tried different things. I did some therapy. I talked to people, and so forth and so on. But basically, I just began to listen to her voice more. And so, in a way, I was groomed to be an asshole by divine right. And then I was groomed to be a human being by Regina Walsh, my wife, Jeannie. And
I,
she was not a bully. She didn't throw her weight around and scream back, but she was powerfully offered me a powerful alternative of what a human being can be. And it really started to change me. But it was a long process. We've been together 55 years.
right. I think that it was a long process. That's the key.
Yeah.
Because when you have that early training, it can get into that automatic basal ganglia system, and
Yeah.
that's a deeply inflexible system.
Yeah.
That's why you can learn to ride a bicycle and you can still remember how to ride a bicycle even years later.
Right.
And and changing it, like I know how to type because of my basal ganglia automatic system. If somebody
Mm-hmm.
went and changed all the letters on the keyboard and I had to learn to type in it, it would take me a long time to reconfigure the neural connection so that I
Sure.
could type somewhat expeditiously with the new keyboard. So for you, what is so encouraging is that we often think of the basal ganglia as supplying unconscious influence to
Mm.
that more consciously aware hippocampal system. So you're consciously aware you're doing whatever your actions, but you're not conscious of that underlying influence.
Yeah.
But in some sense, you are showing you're living a life where that influence went the other way.
Yeah.
You actually begin creating an environment, begin to sort of figure out how to start rewiring. Sure, it's still going to pop out
Yeah.
sometimes,
Yeah.
but I think that's really such a beautifully encouraging message for all
You
of
know,
us.
years later, I read something that you'll know more about, and so I want you to explain it to me better. I read this thing about the neuroplasticity of your brain, that it isn't just that you can change your mind about an issue, but your brain can actually change. And I found that to be true in the sense that for years I would, try to be this better, different person, but I would still feel the old feelings. But if you like riding a bike or learning to play the piano, if I did the right thing, if I can put it that way, enough times, then not only did it become easier, but it became a habit. And
Mhm.
then one day you realize I don't even feel that other way anymore. I've actually changed who I am, this part of who I am. This thing that used to make me angry or whatever doesn't anymore because I've gone, and I think there's terminology for that, isn't it? I mean, can't you can actually rewire bits of your brain.
Yep, and brain plasticity is a wonderful thing, but it's what's so cool is that you, in a very great sense, changed your feelings of identity,
Hmm.
which are often so deeply embedded. This is why I think different groups always want to get at people when they're young, because
Yeah.
that's when you can get them.
Yeah.
And in some ways, you could say that I am no different than that, in that I'm saying when people are young, we should teach them cognitive flexibility
Yeah.
rather than, this path or this path is right.
Well,
And so,
you say that. You say in US schools, the scientific method once taught as a clear step-by-step framework for testing evidence has been set aside in favor of looser, quote, inquiry or science practice approaches. Educated researcher Marcus Emden cautions that when schools drop explicit instruction in the method, students lose practice in the discipline of testing of claims, like I did when I was a fundamentalist, leaving them unprepared when they encounter opposing views. So you actually go to that point in a sort of a different way in your article, or am I making the wrong connection?
no, I think you're making a very legitimate connection.
Yeah,
But, if wondering how, I wonder too how, like, I can see the bottom line is K-12 teachers are really, I mean, yes, there's some bad apples and so forth, but they're such, on average, a really wonderful,
sure.
empathetic. They really want to help people.
Hmm.
And I think when you have a group of people that is like that, um, then it can become easier to, if you say something that superficially sounds
Mm.
really good and you haven't been trained in how to like test things out. I mean, like, pretty much I have met zero K-12 teachers who has ever heard the fact that something like 0.14% of all educational research literature is replicated. And you might say, well, of course I wouldn't know that. But
Yeah,
the bottom line of that is, of all academic fields, education is so bad. It is like way out on the extreme as far as
sure.
really a lot of shoddy research that nobody ever even goes in to check.
Yeah,
So you can get the weirdest things published. Like one of the latest uh, cults and fads coming at you is that if you teach children to do math while they're writing on a vertical surface, they will learn much better. It's published research. You can really, and
yeah,
but teachers, since they are not taught to think in a scientific sort of way
yeah,
about what
yeah,
they're being presented as the latest fad, they really believe that the leadership and the researchers are doing really solid work.
Mm.
And so, but after a while, they become jaded, because it's like this year it's this fad, that year it's that fad.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like education, I hate to say it, and it's not the fault of the teachers, it's the
Mm-hmm.
fault of the researchers, is, it's kind of like medicine was about 200 years ago.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
some bloodletting. It seems to help sometimes.
Give it
Well,
a
the
give it a
patient
whirl.
lived. Yeah.
But what
So
do you think the root of that was? Because I've thought similar things in that there seems to be not just I have a son that's a high school teacher in a very good private school, and it's sort of a very different thing. But when you look at, for instance, my grandchildren's most recent public school experiences, even in a good area public school, um, the teachers, have not been trained in the way some of the brightest people in other fields have. So that when you meet people who are, for instance, at the top of their game in medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, and I've had the privilege of knowing some, they have a completely different aura about them than most of the teachers do because they've been trained in a much more rigorous, serious science-based way, I think. What happened to the idea of education in America to make it such a second-rate profession all across the board in the way we look at it, and for the general public to tolerate this shoddy level of education, and also just why aren't people going to the top Ivy League schools to get their degrees as teachers rather than going to teacher training colleges and so forth, which are notoriously second rate in so many ways. What's that about? And has the teachers' unions played a part in this, in keeping it shoddy because they've been very defensive? How do you really see it if you're being completely honest without any kind of, precondition of like who we're appealing to? And this is not a rhetorical. I don't have an answer. This is a real question to you. What is your theory on the whole mix here? What happened?
So the best, you know, sort of foundation for understanding what's going on in the field of pedagogy is a wonderful book called The Trouble with Ed Schools
Hmm.
by Laborie. I believe it's David Laborie. It's an absolutely fantastic book.
Hmm.
And, so for one thing, we should be clear that teachers are really different than schools of education and the professors of education and
Sure.
professors of pedagogy. These are, this last group these are individuals that the teacher colleges, the normal schools that
Sure.
had been traditionally the places where teachers were trained were sort of integrated in the last century into universities. When
Hmm.
they got integrated into universities, you know, understandably, they were like, well, we need to be kind of like the other university professors.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what that meant was they had to develop theories and then to kind of do studies that proved their theories or something like that. It is super easy to develop a theory and
Hmm.
do studies that prove your theory,
Yeah.
even if your theory is completely wrong.
Yeah.
And so one theory that, and this may raise the hackle of some teachers, because they've been taught that this theory is absolutely, the sine qua non of good teaching.
Yeah.
This is a student-centered kind of constructivist approach. And
Hmm.
constructivist means that students construct their own knowledge.
Hmm.
And the reality is, this idea of constructivism is not falsifiable. Because
Hmm.
if a student doesn't learn something, you just say they constructed bad knowledge,
Sure.
And of course, students have to make those connections within their own brain.
Hmm.
But this whole idea of constructivism, of kind of which is hand in hand with, its student-centered approach, which means that teachers must be on the side, the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage talking to them.
Hmm.
Um, it sounds so good.
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't that sound, it is so caring, compassionate. You're putting yourself in the shoes of the student and you're being supportive of them. And as it turns out, those countries that have adopted constructivist approaches are are the countries that manifest a decline in IQ scores ever since the 1970s,
Yeah.
when these kinds of approaches really begin to be sweeping and broad.
And we're one of those places.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Mhm.
And I spent 6 months in New Zealand, and I tell you, it's ground zero of constructivist approaches. And over the last 30 years, they've gone from the top to the bottom of the, industrialized
Sure.
world. And part of that is simply, whether or not it's what constructivist experts now recommend,
Yeah.
it is often taken as, well, students figure things out on their own. And to teachers, this sounds great. You just kind of plunk some 4 or 5 students together in groups, and they figure out whatever it is. But as it turns out, it kids don't know anything. It took, see, to even come up with the concept of the zero, our brains have 100 trillion connections. It is incredibly difficult to come up with the idea of the zero. That's why it took people, tens of thousands of years and with millions of people to kind of come up with this idea.
Yeah.
Yet we're asking kids to kind of, dance on the head of a pin in some sense, to really move forward. When you put a kid by a problem, even if you have just walked them through a little bit of, the key ideas of this problem, they'll sit down by themselves and they're just like lost.
Sure.
And scaffolding by clever Socratic questions, where you say, oh, well, what does that 3 mean there in the division? Then that narrows the scope of this high dimensional neural space. So it's actually something that's doable. As one paper has shown in Nature Communications, if you have around 85% success rate in what you're doing, students will retain their motivation. But now what you'll frequently find, there was a young woman who wrote during COVID about, she said, I wouldn't, this was an op-ed in the New York Times. She was in 8th grade. She said, I wouldn't wish COVID on anyone, but I have to say it's been really good for my learning, because before in class, they just plop us down in groups. Everything was cooperative learning. And, we just kind of muddle around because we didn't know anything. And teachers were told not to explain things to us because it's supposed to be actively things that we're figuring out. And finally, now that I'm online and taking classes online, I get good instruction. I can actually pay attention to the video. I don't have a bunch of kids fighting around me. I don't have a group. So, there's part of what comes out of this. There's something that I call a paradigm cartel. And that is that a group, you think that professors and, are all highly placed individuals in a field are all kind of working independently. They would never like all join together unless it was kind of, conspiracy theory. But, we know that isn't the case. And there's no conspiracy theory. Well, sometimes there's a little bit of one. For example, in Alzheimer's research, what they found is there's been no progress for the last 30 years. And a big part of that was because everybody believed that amyloid plaques were the cause of Alzheimer's. So you couldn't get funding if you tried to suggest any other approach. You couldn't get published in the top journals. You wouldn't be invited to conferences and so forth because, hey, you're not getting funding and you're not getting published.
Yeah.
And so as it turns out, that field was basically underpinned by what appear to have been completely falsified illustrations in some of the top journals. But everybody was making so much money off of this, and they were building their careers off of these falsified kind of pieces of information, that the whole field was kind of interlocked and blocked.
And got locked. Yeah.
And it's not just in, in what's going on in Alzheimer's research.
Where do you see the reaction on education? Because of course I'm very aware of what's going on the right, but also since I was homeschooled sort of for a while, students were assigned who were, you know, with my parents' personality cult of Labrie Fellowship to, okay, help Frankie learn something. That'll be your work assignment. And then eventually I was put in a British boarding school. Thank goodness, because I actually learned something exactly what you're talking about. There was no kind of neuropsychology involved, and there was no kind of educational theory. Mine was, I had the same result of this declining IQ syndrome of New Zealand just by being left to my own devices with somebody who would sort of try to teach me something. So the result was the same. And then when I finally got to a British boarding school run by Gordon and Eunice Park, and he had been a commander in World War II, and they were not old-fashioned people at all in the way that word is used. They were loved and they were lovely and they were empathetic and kind, and everybody won a prize, so we'd all were good at something. But there's a basic curriculum. You learn math, you learn reading, and I was able to catch up in a 3.5 year span for the first 5 or 6 years that had been nothing, and dyslexic to boot, but put in some sort of a structure where you didn't just make up your own stuff, but you were taught history, including dates and places and geography that went with it, and you were taught math. And I had to have extra tutoring because I was so far behind, and you were taught to read, but there was, you couldn't just make words up. This was the way to do it, and so forth and so on. I have seen in a very non-scientific manner, but also in a way that was very real to me, the difference between a kind of a laissez-faire, do your own thing, let's all just get on and be nice, within this evangelical community. And then, here's a British boys' school, boarding school. This is the way we do things. We've always done this, and this is how it's done. Okay, there were probably some faults in that system, but they gave me the structure gave me a freedom that I never had when I had to figure it out myself.
Right, right. That's such a valuable sort of retelling of how important it is to, number one, provide structure, but also to provide really good, like opportunities for children to acquire expertise, and not
Yeah,
just acquire expertise about what they feel like they want to, because if we're to have a society, we need people with a basic understanding
absolutely.
of numbers, of reading, and
Yeah,
there's a wonderful, Nick Gibb, it was the Minister of Schools in England for 10 years, and he saw the pernicious effects of this constructivist student-centered approach,
yeah.
and really kind of figured out ways to start kind of getting around it, and to start training teachers that actually knew how to teach in ways that students really learn. And the result has been that England has soared in its international rankings. And I look, it makes my heart sick sometimes, because
Mm.
in New Zealand, for example, they'll be like, oh, there's like this incredible problem with students being, in essence, illiterate, a
Yeah.
huge swath of students. And they're kind of like, woe is me. This is really terrible. What are we going to do? But it's kind of like, it's how you're teaching your
And
students.
it's funny you bring this up because just before we talked to you today, I had Jean Twangy on, who's written 10 Rules for Raising Kids
Oh, yes.
in a
Yeah.
High-Tech World. So I just talked to her today. And the funny thing is this kind of fatalism about phones is the same. Your kid has a phone, they're spending all their time in their bedroom. Oh, well, it's too late. They already have a phone. And she's saying, well, what do you mean it's too late? You take the
Yeah.
phone away and you give them a flip phone and say, that's the end of
Well,
that. You're not having a phone in your bedroom at night anymore. We're done.
yep.
And you're saying the same thing in terms of this constructivist approach to education. People saying, well, too late, that's what we do, as if somehow these come from outer space. Aliens command these and we have no choice. Let me ask you a
Whereas
question.
it's
Yeah.
actually your job as a teacher to start helping students learn how to focus. As
Well,
a
and your job as a parent to say, if this phone is, you know, wrecking this child's life in their bedroom every night, wait a minute, you're the parent. You can do something about this. It's that same actual philosophical approach to parenting as the constructivist educational approach. Well, we'll let, the kids have to work it out themselves and so forth. And of course, taken to its logical extreme, no child would survive childhood
Yeah.
because we would
It's
all be
always
dead.
going to be a balance.
Yeah, I mean, if you apply that to kids riding a bike without a helmet, the old thing that, a kid on a bike without a helmet is the next organ donor. I mean, it's cruel, but there it is. It's the truth. Let me ask you a question. Have you, forgive my ignorance, but my way to you was through this article. Um, as someone who's thought about this, have you written some things on this sort of dilemma within education of falling IQs and the whole constructivist thing? I know you've written a bunch of books. Is there
Oh,
something
yes.
comes to
Actually,
mind?
let me.
Is there a book we could have you back on to talk about that you've written?
Well, I am working on the book right now, which is it's actually it's a pretty exciting project.
How
So
far through are you?
let's see, I'm about a third of the way through with my co-author, Kenzen Chen and
And
Dr.
what's it
Su.
about?
It is about exactly what we've been discussing, but also sort of what's going on in how we learn
Hmm.
and how do we learn in this day and age of AI. And I just put a paper into the chat here. It's called the memory paradox.
Mm,
But I think that really the dangerous idea for all of us is that these constructivist student-centered approaches, if you think they're bad now,
yeah,
in the age of AI, they're just like set up to really make things bad. And what is dangerous about all of this is there are some countries that are absolutely taking these insights from neuroscience and taking them on board and actually teaching much more effectively.
yeah.
And if the West doesn't get their act in order, it's not going to be a pretty picture.
Let me ask you a question. When it comes to education these days, do you have any hope in a sort of an off the wall way with some of the homeschool movement in the sense that there are obviously parents out there I'm not just talking about fundamentalist Christians who want to indoctrinate their kids. I mean, parents who are saying, irrespective of their religious views of things, we're going to have to do better because the schools aren't doing the job. And they may not know about constructivist ideology. They might not know what you're talking about, but they certainly have a sense that left to their own devices, an untaught child is not being helped. And they're not going to react well to their kids just using AI for everything. These kind of parents are much more hands-on and attentive. What's going on, broad picture? Are we going to just stumble into the AI shadow with the whole thing, the constructivist approach, and just say, oh, great, now kids can really work it out for themselves. Who needs a teacher? We'll just give them a laptop or an iPad and off to the races. Is the homeschool pushback a little bit of a break on that, or is all lost when it comes to not just Western culture, but the US in particular?
Oh, no, no, it is a good, there is hope ahead.
Yeah.
So, and how that falls out is, look at England and how England has changed things. And if I have my say so with the proposals I'm putting forth and bringing in some pretty good funding sources and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
there will be a new way of training teachers. And part of this will involve absolutely changing accreditation, changing credentialing, and so forth. Because right now you have to be indoctrinated with old-fashioned 100-year-old, in many cases, theory that is maybe partly right, but right in the wrong way at the wrong time
Yeah.
because they don't really understand how the brain is working. So I think there's homeschooling. I all I can say is on average it has some really good outcomes for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of students.
Yeah.
Is it perfect? Well, in some families, I think it's probably about as close as you could be to perfect.
Yeah.
But for everyone who points at homeschooling and says, look at that, they were being indoctrinated. So I'm just like, well, look over here. Not a single kid in this entire school system can even read at grade level. You
Yeah.
know,
Well, and then you read articles now about kids getting to college level between their phones and the constructivist quote education they've had, you know, professors at Harvard saying we're having a trouble telling kids they're going to have to read 8 books a year in human 8 book, whereas, I mean, in other words, this is now starting to show up at the university level where people don't have the concentration, the capacity, or the knowledge or the vocabulary to read um, at a level that, they would have been laughed in 1917, uh, we were doing better when it just came to comprehension and that kind of thing. So obviously the quote system is not working, and it's not a left-right issue. So rebels against the system, even if you don't like the indoctrination factor of their kids with the religion or something, nevertheless, on balance, have to be recognized as doing the nation a favor by turning out people who can read and think, even if it's within the confines of an ideological rigidity when it comes to philosophical belief systems. I don't know how you see that. Talk about your partner a little bit in the context of the book you're writing. How did you all come together to write this new book?
Oh, well, so before I broach that, I want to put a plug in for E.D. Hirsch's. He has a group of 400 schools nationwide in what they call the Core Knowledge Foundation. And this is, it's really learning in a way that is not predisposed to any kind of, religious or
Sure.
it's teaching well. And E.D. Hirsch kind of kicked off this whole idea of teaching well and so forth.
Hey, let me just interpose something here. When we sign off, which I'm not hurrying to do because I'm enjoying this too much, and I forgot we were on a podcast. Now it's just like I met somebody interesting. I literally have forgotten we were on a podcast. I was
Uh,
sitting here, all kidding aside, just talking to you, like, oh, well, maybe this is a FaceTime call on, and we're just, I don't know why I'm talking to. How did we meet? But it
yeah,
was
who is
very
she?
interesting. Let's
Yeah.
just keep talking. But when we do sign off eventually, I'm going to ask you to stick around and talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, for a few moments because we'll pick your brain about guests we should be talking to about this and other subjects. So, E.D. Hirsch, the people he's working with, your co author, you again when you have a book. But give us some names because I am really interested in this, and so's Ernie.
Okay.
Um, and you're talking to the choir here in terms of this whole idea. So, let us help promote some people who maybe not known enough, or maybe our listeners don't know about them. So E.D. Hirsch would be one. There'll be other people. And then let's put together something where you're back talking about this book specifically, even before it comes out. And then another time when it does come out, we'll make it part of our book club. It has to be read and really try to get the word out because we've had between Jean Twenge and people like Brad Wilcox talking about marriage and all these people, tomorrow's people, Paul Moreland, demographers. It's interesting to me how many people are working on things which are very close to what you're doing or very much to do with that parenting, children, education, view of the family, this kind of stuff. And it doesn't seem coincidental to me that we talk to a lot of these people.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. Well, Ken Chen, my co-author on this, he's a professor of education in Taiwan. And so I've done a number of I did a massive open online course on Coursera called Learning How to Learn. That was
Mm.
about 10 years ago. And it has been like one of the mainstays of Coursera in the sense of it's one of their top courses, ever since it launched. Even before it launched, we had like well over 100,000 people signing up, and people just really love the course.
Yeah.
My co-instructor in that is Terry Sinowski. He's a incredible neuroscientist who is deeply into the field of AI. So anyway, this guy writes me out of the blue. And I think he's from Taiwan, but I think at that time was in Idaho as
Mhm.
I think maybe a research fellow but anyway, he wanted to do a Chinese version of the course. But what he wanted to do was take the 3 hours we had and then add on sort of a Confucian framework so that
Mm,
people
mm,
in China could understand it in their own cultural context.
sure.
And so, I talked to Terry, my co-instructor, and he's like, oh yeah, I tell you what, Kenzan can be kind of the you from the Chinese side. And then he has a very good friend, Mu Ming Pu, who is China's top neuroscientist.
Mm.
So he played the Terry, and this massive open online course in Chinese became it won the top award for best massive open online course in China. And then we
We're
started
talking China or Taiwan?
Taiwan. And so, well, depends on how you want to
No,
define
no,
Taiwan.
you know what I'm talking about.
I,
Mainland, should we say mainland China?
yeah, so that was in Taiwan, but also the course has often been kind of put underneath the Great Wall, as they say,
Yeah.
and put into China. And so my books are very popular in China because
Because it would
that's
seem to me to be something that would be what you're talking about would fly in China because they want to compete with the West and dominate us. And if we're not smart enough to do what you're talking about, they're going to do it.
bingo. And they're very, very interested in, how do people really learn? And I mean, it's not like in the States where, you know, years ago they used to say that Bell Telephone, when Bell Telephone owned all the
Sure.
telephone, they said their motto was, we don't care. We don't have to,
Yeah.
because I had everything. So
Yeah.
I sometimes take that and think of that in terms of schools of education in the
Hmm.
US, and
Hmm.
actually around the world. They usually are sort of like, we don't care what's going on with neuroscience or whatever. I mean, they'll have like a little bit of lipstick that they'll put on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
They love to demean neuroscience. And one way they do that is by saying, we're going to teach you all about neuroscience. We're going to teach you neuromyths, which is a way of kind of
Sure.
implying that neuroscience is full of all these myths.
Yeah. Well, they're kind of scared of science because they don't want to go there.
Bingo.
Otherwise it might rock the boat. I mean, that I grew up with that in an evangelical family. I mean, we're going to teach you, humanist myths
Right.
like evolution, so we can go back and cling to our biblical interpretation of
Oh,
creation.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's that, hey, if you've been raised in a fundamentalist family, by the way, you're prepared for all of this because
Yeah.
whether it's, the far reaches of the left on the trans movement or whether it's the far reaches of the right on certainty about whatever it is, it's like emotionally, I've seen all this before. And it's this absolute certainty that your little neck of the woods has the correct information and everybody else is either awful or or you feel threatened, so let's ignore them. And of course, the second wave of the feminist movement in the 1970s had a lot of this in it. We don't want to know about science because there might be something in there that tells you that, men and women are not identical. And there are differences. So any movement you look at some point goes through a period where, like my fundamentalist parents, they fear the information. And I was raised on the idea that there's no such thing as good therapy because it's just a humanist thing dealing with problems that are actually spiritual problems. And if you got your heart right with the Lord, all this would be resolved. You don't need to talk to a therapist.
Yeah.
Same
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, what can we do to, when you talk to Ernie here in a minute, you're going to talk about some of these people and your future project, because I'm absolutely lit up here in terms of following what you're talking about. And how it applies to everything. I have a son who teaches in high school in physics, and he went back to Harvard for a year. He had been to Georgetown School of Foreign Service and got a top prize there, and then started teaching high school as a temporary job. And that's 37 years ago. And he rebuilt the physics and science department. And then the little school he teaches in, called the Waring School in Beverly, Massachusetts, which has 175 students, won the top prize in the coding and robotics for the whole world, and they were sent to
Wow.
represent the USA, and that's his program. So he's
Wow.
had a big battle sometimes with some of the other teachers who come from the constructivist position, and it's all about getting along with students. And of course, he's teaching physics and science, and there aren't 1,000 ways to make a robot correctly coded.
Yeah. They hate that. Sometimes I
He
know.
didn't win the he did not win the top world prize for the Waring School with his team by teaching them, that there are many ways to come at this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's And what is difficult too is a lot of constructivist approaches involve, there's got to be many ways, and they teach many ways, so that means that no one really gets one way that they
Right.
know well.
Yeah. Well, my son Francis would eat this up and be sitting at your feet saying, "Tell me more," because all his battles within the academic community are, hey, listen, we are a school. This isn't therapy. This is education.
Yes, you know what I can do? I can send you my proposal towards the end of the week for the book.
Good. And I will read it with incredible interest. Ernie will give you my email. Please send it to me.
Okay.
We will have you back on to talk about that. Will you stick around and talk to Ernie for a few minutes about everybody we should be talking to and over this next time of podcast, and then help us keep track of your thing. And then I'll read your proposal and follow your thing with great interest. We'll come back and do another one when the book's out. But in the meantime, maybe have you back with, we can talk to people individually, or you can say, I'd love to be a guest along with so-and-so who's a partner in researching this, whether it's, Hirsch or some of the people you're working with or your co-author, whatever. We're open to anything on this.
Okay, well, it all sounds great, and all I can say was this was the funnest conversation I've had in a very long time.
Hey, me too. Like I say, I don't know what Ernie's thinking because he's my producer. It's like this is supposed to be a podcast, and you just sort of went off and talked away. But
It's,
stick around and talk.